James Abbott McNeill Whistler is an American painter who spent a great deal of time in Europe, and he even studied in Paris with the academic artist Jean-Léon Gérôme. But he also knew the Impressionists and was quite good friends with many of them. In fact, Camille Pissarro said about him, quote, "This American is a great artist and the only one of whom America can be justly proud." So while he knew about academic art, he knew about Impressionism, he dabbled in realism and also the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood style, which was popular in England. He really doesn't associate himself with any single movement and kind of prefers to draw on all of these disparate styles and to continue to kind of experiment with paint. So when he showed this work, first in London and then later in Paris, it provoked this buzz about the interpretation of the work. So everyone was wondering who she was. Is she a fallen bride? Why is her hair down, which was very casual? She holds one little white flower. The rest of the flowers look as though they've fallen on this bearskin rug. And so it was all about the interpretation of the work. Who is she? What does it symbolize? What does it mean? But what Whistler was after was really just a study of white on white. So the model is his Irish lover, Joanna Heffernan. And he wanted to contrast the white of her flesh with the white of the dress, with the white of the flower on a white backdrop, which is a really unconventional thing to do. But in a sense, he's kind of experimenting with paint in the same way that, let's say, a composer might be experimenting with different sounds. In fact, he is one of the first artists to make this analogy between painting and the move towards abstraction and musical composition. And he says about this, "Art should be independent of all claptrap. It should stand alone and appeal to the artistic sense of ear or eye, without confounding this with emotions that are entirely foreign to it. That's why I insist on calling my works arrangements and harmonies." But this was provocative, to call this work a symphony in white, to refer to a portrait of his mother as an arrangement in gray and black, which is very similar to music composition, was quite unconventional. He also had this wonderful analogy between painting and music where he said, quote, "Nature contains the elements in color and form of all pictures, as the keyboard contains the notes of all music. But the artist is born to pick and choose and group with science these elements, that the result may be beautiful, as the musician gathers his notes and forms his chords, until he brings forth from chaos glorious harmony." Now, he would also cause lots of controversy wherever he went. Here in this work called The Princess of the Porcelain, I think you can very clearly see the influence of Japanisme. There's this European-looking woman who's dressed in a Japanese kimono, standing on an oriental carpet, the folding screen behind her, a vase, and of course she's holding a fan in addition to the fan that's placed over here. Now, this work was actually created first, and then it was purchased by a man who was redecorating his dining room. And he wanted a dining room that would showcase his collection of Chinese and Japanese porcelain. So he purchased the painting from Whistler, and he contracted with an architect to design the room. Now, the walls that were designed by the architect were brown leather that was allegedly taken from the Spanish Armada, and very valuable leather. But when Whistler came to install the painting, he got to talking with the architect, who was kind of in a hurry to get on to his next job. And Whistler said, I'll finish this up for you. You go ahead, you take that next job. I'll just finish this up. And inspired by Japanese design, which was this much more holistic approach to design, where you would not only do like the exterior of the building, but you would also design the interior, the carpets, the wall decorations, the furniture, all of it. Whistler had this idea that he could transform this entire room. And so he quickly decided that he thought the porcelains would look better against not brown leather walls, but rather this thick blue-green enamel paint that he covered the leather walls with. And then he painted what looked like peacock feathers on the ceiling, and he created all of these designs that relate to peacocks. Needless to say, he was not asked to do this by the man who owned the home, and so when he returned and found Whistler painting the room blue-green and covering it with peacock feathers, he was outraged. And he was even more horrified when he learned that not only had Whistler taken this upon himself and gone against his wishes, but he'd also been inviting members of the public, collectors, art critics, all kinds of people in to see this masterwork that he was creating. Mr. Leland, who owned the home, was not happy. And so Whistler said, okay, I'll take less money than we'd originally agreed upon. You'll just pay for the painting, but let me finish my project. And Mr. Leland says, okay, but he becomes more and more irritated with Whistler the more he hears about the various people he's inviting in to see the room. And so he decides, knowing that Whistler's quite sensitive, that he will insult him by paying him in guineas, in guineas rather than in pounds. So in England at the time, one currency was used for people who were of the upper class, and that was guineas, and the pound was used for people who were of the lower class. So let's say you hired a plumber or an electrician, they would be paid in pounds, whereas a lawyer, a doctor, would be paid in guineas. So while they used the agreed upon amount, Mr. Leland decided that he would insult Whistler by paying him in pounds rather than in guineas. But in a sense, Whistler gets the last laugh because he paints this wall, which is opposite the painting, last. And he calls this little version of two peacocks who are squabbling, one who's rather haughty looking and has a pile of gold coins at his feet, and the other who's sort of humbly walking away, art and money, or the story of this room. This room, by the way, can be seen fully installed in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. It's part of the Asian Art Gallery, the Freer collection. So it's no longer in Mr. Leland's dining room in London, but the whole piece still stands together and can be seen in the Smithsonian. Controversy was never far from Whistler. In fact, when he created this work, which he called Nocturne in Black and Gold in 1875, it was put on view, and the British art critic John Ruskin wrote in his article that Whistler had, quote, charged 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Now, that published comment caused Whistler to sue. He was so offended and outraged that he sued the critic for libel. And although he bankrupted himself in the process to cover the legal fees and had to sell off his own collection of Japanese and Chinese porcelains, he does ultimately win. And this is important because this is really the first critical success or kind of early victory for abstract painting. The fact that the court was able to see that this was in fact a thought-out painting and not just a childish expression of throwing paint in the public's face was a recognition that art can take on different forms of expression. Now, I mentioned that Whistler was highly influenced by Japanese art. In fact, he was also looking at this print by Hiroshige, which is called Fireworks at Ryogoku, when he created Nocturne in Black and Gold. And now I think when I show you the two side by side, you might see that there is water. It looks as though someone's kind of standing on the edge of water, and these are fireworks going off in the distance as they were here, but he's taken it to a new level and abstracted it. So Whistler is extremely important because this will be an early victory for abstract art, which will become a major piece of what we'll be talking about in 20th century art. And also because he is kind of pushing the envelope of what art can be.